I'm Clive Stafford-Smith. I am the director of the charity Reprieve, but far more importantly, I'm the father of Wilfred and the husband of Emily and a cricketer with the Mapperton Marauders, which is very, very important. And because I have to do flagrant self-promotion, I have just come out with a book called Injustice. When you think about generosity and kindness, paradoxically, the most generous thing that ever happened to me was at an execution in Georgia. I was representing a guy called Larry Lonchar, who was bipolar, and my dad was bipolar. And Larry and I had had a terribly difficult relationship, partly because he knew how to press my buttons, and partly because he kept dropping his appeals. When he would get depressed, the Georgia prison system wouldn't give him medication because they wanted him depressed, because then he'd drop his appeals and they'd try and execute him. And we went through this time and time again. 4 times we came within half an hour of him being electrocuted. Once we came 58 seconds away from the time he was meant to be electrocuted before we got a stay from the US Supreme Court. And it was all terribly traumatic, by far and away most traumatic for Larry, of course. And it was agonizing in so many ways, because I would persuade him to pick his appeals up, in part by telling him what they were going to do to him. I mean, we were litigating the whole notion of electrocution. It was ghastly. Anyway, it was difficult. He's the only person who's ever attacked me in a prison. And then we came around, we won in the US Supreme Court, we won his case, and he was going to have a chance to get a new trial. But he got depressed again, and he dropped his appeals again for what turned out to be the last time. By this point, Larry had become very religious, and he had become very Christian. And whatever people say about the opiate of the masses, it sure was good for Larry. And he had no fear whatsoever of dying. And he wanted to die. He just had enough of being on this earth. And I was driving down to the prison with my wife, and we pulled off, and we got Larry on the phone to see how he was going. And he said that he wanted to pick up his appeals again. There was about 2 hours before he was set to die. And so I rushed off to a phone and called the judge to try and get a stay. And Larry's on the phone with Emily, and I'm sorry, this makes me a bit emotional actually, because, and it gets worse, I'll tell you, because Larry talks to Em and says, "Oh, how's Clive?" And she says, "Oh, you know, he's happy as a clam off trying to get this stopped." And he said, "Well, I only did it for him because I know he can't get it stayed now, but I felt I owed it to him to let him have another go, so he wasn't just sitting around." And then we got down to the prison, and we didn't get a stay. The judge, you know, the law was on our side, but momentum wasn't. And so I'm talking to Larry. They won't let me in to see him. I'm allowed to watch him die a bit later, but they won't let me see him before he's set to die. And I'm on the phone with him, and we're talking. And Larry said to me, just before they're going to kill him, he said, "You're the only friend I've ever had." And it was incredibly moving. And it was just, I mean, obviously, an execution is not something you normally tout as a wonderful moment. But actually, of all the things in my life, that was probably the kindest anyone has ever been. And he was totally calm, and the fact that they were going to put 2,400 volts of electricity through his head was, you know, not something that bothered him. And then I went in to witness his death. It's the whole ghastly thing where they've shaved his head and all the rest of it. Larry was still totally calm. What I loved about it was he was always contrarian, old Larry. And when they asked him if he had any final words, he looked at him and he said, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do," which really pissed off the Christians of Georgia, to have someone who was, you know, getting executed and who was meant to be such a evil guy say that. And then, you know, then they killed him. And anyway, one of these days I shall do Larry some justice and write a book about him. In fact, I've written most of it, but I'm not going to publish it now for various reasons. But he was very, very kind. You know, when you ask what's the essence of generosity, there are certain things about life that just are so obvious. It's hard for me to understand why it's not obvious to everyone. And One is that the notion that we would have a society that's predicated on selfishness, that we encourage you to be selfish and run around like Bob Diamond trying to get lots of money for yourself, it's just idiotic, isn't it? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And it's obviously correct to encourage people to be generous to each other, because if you are, everyone goes around saying, I'm going to do something nice for other people today, then everyone's better off. I mean, it's blindingly obvious, isn't it? And, when we talk about flat Earth society issues, we tend to think of people who thought the world was flat, and, we think, oh, how stupid they are. We know it's a globe. But the challenge is not to look back in history about what flat Earth ideas were 200 years ago and laugh at them. The challenge is to look at ourselves and say of ourselves, what are the things we believe that are just idiotic? And frankly, that's what I just wrote a book about, but that's about the judicial process. But there are many others that are similar, and the most obvious is that we should just treat each other nicely and kindly and encourage people to spend their lives helping other people, because then everyone's better off.